So welcome everyone. Thank you all for joining into our inaugural session on Monash University's distinguished lectures. Uh, I would like to start by acknowledging the people of the Kulin Nations on whose lands we are gathered today. I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. I also acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands you are joining us from today. So our colleagues will put a Slido link in the chat. You can use this link to enter your questions. We will leave all the Q&A to the end, and we will try to attend to these questions at the end of the talk. And so my name is Muhammad Eskin. I'm a faculty member at the Faculty of Information Technology, Monash University. And today we are honored to welcome Professor Martin Hellman to deliver our first distinguished lecture. Professor Hellman is the recipient of the 2015 ACM Turing Award, widely regarded as the Nobel Prize of Computing. He co-invented public key cryptography, a breakthrough foundational to the establishment of digital security and privacy. And as a professor at Stanford University, his contributions to cryptography have transformed global communication and security. And he is best known for this invention of public key cryptography. And this is the technology that basically enables secure internet transactions and is used to transfer literally trillions of dollars every single day. And he has been a long-time contributor to the computer privacy debate and was a key participant in the so-called the first crypto war of the late 1970s and early 80s. And this established the right of academic cryptographic researchers to publish their papers free of government interference. And Professor Hellman has a deep interest in the ethics of technological development, and his current focus is on rethinking national security. And that approach has been endorsed by a number of prominent individuals, including the former Secretary of Defense, Leon Panetti, and Stanford's President Emeritus John Hennessy. And his work has been recognized by a long list of honors and awards that I'm not going to repeat, but this includes election to the American National Academy of Engineering. So he is a very well-established and well-known expert in this field and has many accomplishments that I'm not going to repeat. I would like to leave more time for his talk. And I guess without further ado, I will leave it over to Martin. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you, Mohammed. Am I on now? Is it working okay?
Yeah, if you want to share the slides, you can bring them up. Otherwise,
okay. Now, actually, I think I'll wait for that. But
okay.
Thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you, those people who are attending. So I'm going to divide the talk into two pieces. The first is on cryptography, a little more technical, and the second on open science, of which cryptography is a part. So the first part is, why is cryptography needed? Well, even if I gave you access to the main post office in Australia, reading physical mail is slow and expensive, so encryption is rarely used. On the other hand, if the information is in computer readable form, it can be scanned very cheaply and rapidly. I've estimated that you could search roughly 10 to the 14th, which is 100 million words for $1. And it doesn't matter whether you use Australian dollars or American dollars because they're within a factor of 2 of each other. This is a very rough number. But still, 100 million words for $1 can be scanned if it's in computer readable form. Compare that to steaming open envelopes and trying to read things by hand. And public key cryptography, which is what I invented with Whit Diffie and Ralph Merkle, makes encryption much easier to use. So public key cryptography, someone told me about 15 years ago that it protects trillions, which is millions of dollars a day in financial transactions. And when he told me this, I said, oh, you mean trillions of dollars a year? And he said, no, he meant trillions of dollars a day. And actually, it's more like almost 10 trillion, especially Australian dollars per day right now. And it's at the heart of e-commerce. It also allows secure software updates. So how does my iPhone know that a software update is coming from Apple and not from someone malevolent a user who's trying to put malware on the device, they use a secret key to sign the software, and a public key in my phone checks the signature. And so even if someone takes my phone apart and gets the public key, they don't get the secret key that's used for signing. And in the same way, public key cryptography allows e-commerce in general. In fact, when I give general talks, I often ask people in the audience, how many of you have used how many have used cryptography, much less public key cryptography? And usually nobody raises their hand. I then ask, how many people have done electronic banking? Everybody raises their hand. How many of you have bought something on the internet with a credit card? Again, hands go up. And so I point out to them that they've used cryptography. They just didn't know they were using it. It was integrated, automatic, and transparent, which is the way it should be. And by the way, public key cryptography is also critical to blockchain technology. And so let me share a picture. Let's see, share. There we go. Let me slideshow, play from current slide. So this is a picture taken soon after 1976. I'm in the middle with a beard. Ralph Merkel is on my right, your left, with a tall guy. And Whit Diffie, my main partner in crime, is on my left, your right, with the long blonde hair. And we're actually looking at a blank piece of paper. The photographer said, we need a prop. And so I said, well, we can go down to the computer room, and we're looking at a blank piece of paper as if it's really important, because he needed a prop. So let me see, let me go here and stop sharing. So public key cryptography allows the seemingly impossible. What does it do? Well, it allows the seemingly impossible. And so let's imagine Whit and I want to plan a surprise birthday party for my wife, Dorothy. And we're doing this over the insecure internet. We need to securely exchange information that Dorothy cannot understand. And that's what public key cryptography does, which sounds impossible, and it is impossible if Dorothy has unlimited computational power. Of course, nobody has unlimited computational power. And so the real question is, can we, with a limited amount of computation, Whit and I, maybe less than a second of CPU time, exchange information that would take Dorothy millions of years to understand? And for simplicity, let's consider messages written on a piece of paper. And I'm going to share the screen again. And let's see, here we go. And let me go now, slideshow, play from current slide. Okay, so here's me on the left, Whit on the right. We're all dressed up, and Dorothy's in the middle. And I've got a message that I want to send to Whit. And unfortunately, I've got to pass it through Dorothy. Because remember, this is a physical message. It's not, we're actually doing this over the internet, but we're using a physical example. So I lock the message up in a strongbox, and I put Marty's lock, ML, on it, and I hand it to Dorothy. I'd like to tell Whit the combination to the lock, but if I had done that, Dorothy would have been able to open it when she handed it to Whit. I've made the hasp on the lock big enough that Whit can put his own lock on the box, Whit's lock, WL. And so now it's doubly locked. He passes it back to Dorothy. She can't take off either lock. When I get it, what can I do? I can take off my lock, leaving only Whit's lock. I then pass it back to Dorothy. She can't open it, but when Whit gets it, he can. He knows Whit's combination. He gets the message. And it's important that I made the strongbox big enough to put two locks on. That made it commutative. And commutativity is needed. And just to remind you, addition is commutative. 2 plus 3 is the same as 3 plus 2. You get 5 either way. But division is not commutative. 6 divided by 2 is 3, but 2 divided by 6 is 1/3. So they're not equal if you do the operations in reverse order. It was important that the locks were commutative. They could be taken off in either order. Removing the locks would not have been commutative if only one lock could fit on the box at a time. So for example, if I'd only made the box big enough to put my lock on, then when Whit got it, after Dorothy passed it to him, he could put his lock on a bigger box, putting my box inside. But when I got it, I couldn't get inside to take off my lock. And so it would not have been commutative. And the important thing is that the discrete exponential function that I came up with for Diffie-Hellman-Merkle key exchange, as I prefer to call it, or Diffie-Hellman key exchange, as it's usually called, is a commutative one-way function. And I underline Merkle because it's actually a Merkle system. Whit and I came up with public key crypto systems at Stanford. Ralph Merkle, working independently at Berkeley, came up with a public key distribution system. And what I came up with, what's now called Diffie-Hellman key exchange, is actually a Merkle system. Let's see. Let me go here, stop sharing. Okay. You see me again?
Yep.
Okay, I'm
Good.
assuming you do. If you don't, tell me if you don't. So now I'm going to switch to talking about open science, but some cryptography will come into that as well. And science knows no boundaries. Advances in one nation are soon replicated in others. And so technology, which is essential to national security, makes it impossible to have national security because true security requires greater international cooperation. The only kind of security that's beginning to make sense, it's not there yet, but it's beginning to make sense, is international security of all nations. But we still are stuck thinking in terms of national security. And let me bring up something here. Wait a second. Okay, I'm going to get rid of this. Yeah. So to use Einstein's words, which he said soon after Hiroshima and Nagasaki ushered in the nuclear era, the unleashed power of the atom has changed everything, save our modes of thinking, and we thus drift toward unparalleled catastrophe. So he said that the unleashed power of the atom has changed everything except the way we think, and that was causing us to drift toward unparalleled catastrophe. To avoid that unparalleled catastrophe, we need a new mode of thinking which recognizes that national security is becoming increasingly dependent on the global security of all nations. My project on rethinking national security makes that point and has been endorsed by a number of Americans with impeccable security credentials, including, as Mohammed pointed out, former Secretary of Defense Leon Panetta and a former director of the U.S. National Security Agency, also known as NSA, Admiral Bobby Inman. This is a guy who wanted to throw me in jail 45 years ago. He's now a good friend. The statement that they signed asks, in this age of nuclear weapons, pandemics, cyber attacks, terrorism, and environmental crises, is national security becoming inseparable from global security? If so, how do our current policies need to change? If we make that shift, not only can we avoid the unparalleled catastrophe that Einstein recognized we were headed for in the old mode of thinking, but we will build a world that we can be proud to pass on to future generations. And continuing the openness of science is critically important to that task. Let's see. There we go. Nuclear weapons may be the first example of the need for greater international cooperation, but environmental crises like climate change, genetic engineering, cyber technology, and of course, artificial intelligence are adding to that need. Science can help us make that shift from the old mode of thinking to a new one. One of my primary mentors in this area was a Stanford professor. He was born in the 1890s, so he's no longer with us. This was Professor Harry Rathbun. And he defined the scientific spirit as a zealous search for the truth, a fierce search for the truth, with a ruthless disregard for commonly held beliefs when contradicted by the observed data. When Harry said this, he emphasized zealous and ruthless. He then noted that we have made great advances in science utilizing this approach, and we also need to apply it to societal issues such as nuclear weapons, war, and environmental crises. And I'm going to propose three questions as a starting point for Harry's zealous search for the truth. First, how reasonable is society's current approach to nuclear weapons, war, and international relations? Have we done all that we reasonably can to minimize the risk of committing genocide on a scale that would dwarf the Holocaust and the carnage of the Second World War? Second, How reasonable is society's current response to climate change, including my own nation's current approach? Are our actions consistent with the costs, the risks, and the uncertainties? Are the costs so high, the risks so great, and the risks so minimal and the uncertainty so great that we should be doing no more than we're now doing? Should we be calling it a hoax? And third, is scientific dominance possible in a world where advances in one nation are soon replicated in others? This relates really very closely to open science. So let me say that again. Is scientific dominance possible in a world where advances in one nation are soon replicated in others? The new mode of thinking demanded of us by technological advances also requires that we face ourselves honestly, both individually and as nations. One of the major obstacles to doing that is what psychology calls our shadow side. That's the part of our psyches that's so abhorrent to us that we cannot consciously admit that it exists. And I know about this because I personally experienced it, as I'll soon discuss. Instead, we push our shadow down into our unconscious where it's free to work its mischief. 60 years ago, let's see, 60 years ago, let me bring this up. Screen share, slideshow from current slide. Carl Jung, the famous Swiss psychiatrist, wrote in 1964, actually he didn't write it then because he died in 1961, but the book was published in 1964. Mankind is now threatened by self-created and deadly dangers that are growing beyond our control. Western man, becoming aware of the aggressive will to power of the East, and by this he meant the Soviet Union, sees himself forced to take extraordinary measures of defense at the same time as he prides himself on his virtue and good intentions. What he fails to see is that it is his own vices that are thrown back in his face shamelessly and methodically. What the West has tolerated in itself comes back into the open and in full measure from the East and ties us up in neurotic knots. It is the face of his own evil shadow that grins at Western man from the other side of the Iron Curtain. Jung goes on, but all attempts to resolve the problem have proved singularly ineffective and will do so as long as we try to convince ourselves and the world that it's only they, our opponents, who are wrong. It would be much more to the point for us to make a serious attempt to recognize our own shadow and its nefarious doings. If we could, we should be immune to any moral and mental infection and insinuation. End of quote from Carl Jung. So let me stop sharing and hit this back. Let's see. Okay, so two political cartoons that I saw in the 1980s when I was working on these issues, so admittedly 40 years ago roughly, illustrate how nations project their shadow sides onto one another. The first one was a cartoon in an American newspaper. It showed the Russian bear, its fangs bared menacingly with rabid slobber dripping from its mouth, clawing madly at a map of Eastern Europe, leaving it torn to shreds. A cartoon in Moscow that I saw about the same time showed the American eagle staring ominously out from a poster, its talons dripping with blood, clutching a rolled up map marked Latin America. Each cartoon, let's see. Each cartoon had some truth in its message, but each made a major mistake that made it totally ineffectual. That's because it focused on the mistakes of the other, where it had no power to produce change. Even worse, if you showed either political cartoon to citizens of the other nation, most of them would have objected that they were merely responding to the kind of aggression depicted in their own cartoon. Now, about 40 years ago, I had a deeply personal experience of my shadow side at work, so I know that this goes on. Otherwise, prior to that, I would have agreed with the concept, but been unaware of how powerful it can be. The following story is contained in a book that my wife and I wrote with the subtitle, Creating True Love at Home and Peace on the Planet. This is a copy of the book that you can see. And we've made a free PDF available on my website, and the link for that is available from the organizers of this talk. A former U.S. Secretary of Defense, not Leon Panetta, this time Bill Perry, recommended that the book should, quote, be read by married couples seeking peace at home, as well as by diplomats seeking peace in the world. Returning to my deeply personal experience of my shadow side at work, it was in the 1980s. My wife and I were working with a group dedicated to spreading the new mode of thinking. And the way it worked is we recruited new people by showing a video and having a discussion. Most of the people were using a video that I hated because I thought it was overdone. I thought it was a piece of propaganda. But my wife finally pulled out the ace that she keeps up her sleeve. She said, why don't you try it just once as an experiment? Well, I'm an engineer, a scientist, and so how could I be so close-minded as not to try it just once as an experiment? But boy, when I did that, I realized that I hated the video, not because the video was bad, but because the main speaker resonated with my shadow at an unconscious level. To me, the speaker, his name was Jack Geiger, he's a professor in New York. He seemed to be an arrogant Jewish professor from New York. I'm Jewish, I'm a professor, I'm from New York. Adding arrogance to the mix was just too much. By hating him, which I came to see as the problem, not the video, that's what I thought was the problem, I must have thought I could convince myself and the world that I was different, that I wasn't arrogant. But as I dealt with this, and as I made friends with my shadow side, I realized that arrogance and courage were related. In fact, what I saw as courage, some others might see as arrogance. So now that I've made peace with my shadow side, if someone should indicate that they thought I was being arrogant rather than getting tied up in what Carl Jung called neurotic knots, I would try to dial my courage or arrogance, whichever it was, depending on your perspective. I'd try to dial it back a notch. Some people are more like me and would see it as courage. Others are more like that hypothetical person and will see arrogance. Ironically, courage or arrogance was involved in the work that won me the ACM Turing Award. Initially, all of my colleagues told me I was crazy to work in that area. And let me see, I want to, yeah. Yeah, I'll do this here. So let me share a screen, PowerPoint, slideshow, play from current slide. So this is the wisdom of foolishness, and I have a whole talk on this that you can watch, done about 15 years ago at Stanford University. And again, the link to that, I think, is available from the organizers. And my experience where people said I was crazy to work in cryptography was far from unique. Ralph Merkel's proposal to independently develop half of public key cryptography, we didn't know about his work, which is why it was independent, was initially seen as foolish. He was an undergraduate and a master's student at UC Berkeley. And here he was taking CS 244, a computer science course, in the fall of 1974, and he had to do a term project, and he put in two project proposals. Project number one is described here, and you can read it. Establishing secure communications between separate secure sites over insecure communication lines, with the assumptions that no prior arrangements have been made between the two sites, and it is assumed that any information known at either site is known to the enemy. The sites, however, are now secure, and any new information will not be divulged. What did the professor say? Project number two, which was much more mundane, and I haven't even indicated it here, the professor said, looks more reasonable, maybe because your description of project one is muddled terribly. Talk to me about these today. Well, Ralph didn't talk to the professor. He dropped the course and he went off and developed public key cryptography on his own. He then submitted a paper to the CACM, the communications of the ACM, which initially rejected his paper. This is what one of the reviewers wrote. In fact, the reviewer wrote about his book. Thank you about his paper, rather. Thank you very kindly for your communication of October 7th with the enclosed paper on secure communications over insecure channels. I am sorry to have to inform you that the paper is not in the mainstream of present cryptographic thinking, and I would not recommend that it be published in the CACM. And he gave some reasons which were bullshit, but that's a whole nother thing. Vince Cerf, who is one of many of you know of, and he was a true father of the internet, told me that the underlying technology, which is the internet IP protocol, the internet protocol, was regarded as crazy at first. Brad Parkinson, who's the chief architect of GPS, wrote to me that the Air Force thought GPS was foolish. In those days, a GPS receiver cost $250,000 US, almost $500,000 Australian dollars, weighed 150 pounds, about 70 kilos, and used 2 kilowatts of power. You needed a Honda generator to power the thing. But Brad wrote to me that he could foresee the digital revolution underway. And today, that same GPS receiver is a small fraction of a chip using milliwatts of power. Many Nobel laureates had similar experiences. With Danny Shechtman, the Nobel Prize winner in chemistry in 2011, his work on quasi-crystals was initially derided as quasi-science by Linus Pauling, who won 2 Nobel Prizes, first in chemistry and then in peace. Lou and Yarrow, who won the 1998 Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine, told me a year and a half ago that before his work paid off, the dean came to him and said something like, "Lou, we hired you because you did good work. Why are you doing this crazy stuff?" Crazy stuff that won him the Nobel Prize. So trying to expand the openness of science is clearly a fool's errand, but that is really a compliment, as this shows, not a criticism. Stop sharing. There we go. Let me go back here. And scientists have a special role to play. Let me just take a quick look and see here. Yeah. Scientists have a special role to play in creating the new mode of thinking needed for survival in this technological age. They understand the scientific spirit's zealous search for the truth with a ruthless disregard for commonly held beliefs when contradicted by the data. And they understand what I call the wisdom of foolishness, that the best ideas often appear foolish before they pay off. There's also a precedent. In late 1987, I co-edited a book, and let me show you the cover. Actually, I don't have to do that. Let me go back here. Let's see. Oh, well, maybe I will have to share. And stop me if you're not seeing the covers of Breakthrough. So this is a book that I was co-editor of with Anatoly Gromyko in 1987. It was called Breakthrough Emerging New Thinking, or in Russian, Proriv. And it was Soviet and Western scholars issue a challenge to build a world beyond war. We realized that you couldn't solve the nuclear threat in isolation. You really had to solve the mentality of war. And today I go even further back. Former director of the CIA, William Colby, gave us an endorsement for the book in 1987. He wrote, "It's an impressive and immensely valuable product of Soviets and Americans trying to surmount the mountains which separate our cultures in a search for a common way of thinking about the central threat to us all, nuclear weaponry, and the ultimate obscenity of nuclear war. Our differences," he wrote, "are real, but this book and the collaboration which produced it are the only way to thread them through them to produce a world in which all our children can live safely." Might international, let's see, let me stop sharing. So the question now becomes, might international scientists undertake a similar effort today and thereby help prevent a conflict that would cause untold harm to the entire world, either through nuclear weapons or climate change or any of the other technological threats that we face? Of course, much more is needed, as seen by the current poor state of relations between the United States and Russia. Breakthrough provides a precedent, but also a caution that more is needed. There is another precedent, however, of scientists calling attention to the opportunities that society currently sees as threats. That's the 1955 Russell-Einstein Manifesto, which eloquently stated our two choices. Let me see, I think I've got that here. Yes, I'm going to share again. And let me go to slideshow, play from current slide. The Russell-Einstein Manifesto in 1955 said, "There lies before us if we choose continual progress in happiness, knowledge, and wisdom. Shall we instead choose death because we cannot forget our quarrels? We appeal as human beings to human beings. Remember your humanity and forget the rest. If you can do so, the way lies open to a new paradise. If you cannot, there lies before you the risk of universal death." And let me end with one other saying of Harry Rathbun. This was what he called the noble hypothesis, because many people will say, and I have to admit that it probably appears that I'm on a fool's errand, and we're probably not going to succeed, and society will probably crumble. But Harry pointed out when he was still alive that there are two basic hypotheses concerning humanity's capacity for change in this technological age. The noble hypothesis is that we can change. We have the capacity to do that. The less noble hypothesis is that we're doomed. Harry then pointed out, if we accept the less noble hypothesis, we're doomed even if we had the capacity for change, because we won't think we had the ability to change. But he pointed out, if we accept the noble hypothesis, the worst that happens is we go down fighting, and the best that happens is we cheat the Grim Reaper, where logic would have said we had almost no chance. So Harry said with a twinkle in his eye, which I agree with now, why not assume the noble hypothesis? Why not adhere to open science, recognize that we're all going to live together or we're all going to die together? So with that, let me stop. And I think this is where I'm going to take questions. Yes, I'm done with my talk, and let me now take questions.
Thank you very much, Martin, for your interesting talk. So I'll have a look at the questions here. Maybe
Yeah, if you would.
I'll first bring up the Slido link again. 1 second. Okay. Okay. So if anyone has any questions, as was shared in the chat, you can use the Slido link to add your questions. So I'll start with the first question. So you mentioned early on that the public key infrastructure is used in shopping and banking. And the question is around this, and it says, it's interesting that while we use PKI in shopping and banking, we don't use it in ordinary communication, for example, to prevent phishing.
So you want me to comment on that?
Yeah, I guess this is.
Okay, well, I just had a gentleman here who was the general counsel for a corporation with which I worked in the 1980s, and they had a chip. It was Silent Corporation, if you've heard of them. And so let's see. Oh, I pointed out to him that banks, all of my financial institutions send me emails that are training me to fall for phishing expeditions. They say, to download your statement, click here.
Yeah.
Well, how do I know that it's from them and not from a phisher? I always go to a bookmark that I keep. So that's actually more fundamental. This came up when he was asking me about how I handle passwords, and there's no really good way to handle passwords right now. But one thing we can do, even more fundamentally, is to use bookmarks and not trust any emails from our financial institutions.
Yeah. Yeah, I also agree that as the emails get like kind of more fancy in the way that they want to like use like buttons and like all these fancy other artwork, it gets more difficult to really detect
Yeah,
these.
and by the way, I also think that they should have had, maybe still could have, ways to detect for a secret key to be used by the financial institution to sign their emails that are verified using its public key by my mail application. But that's not done.
Yeah. Hmm. And there is one question around quantum computing, and it asks, are we getting close to quantum computing upsetting PKI?
No, that's a simple answer. And also, the general counsel, former general counsel from Silent, asked me that question too. And what I said to him was, I'm not an expert on quantum computing, but I've talked to people who are, and the ones that I trust have all said that it will be at least 10 years before we know whether quantum computing will even be a threat to the current cryptographic methods. And it'll be at least another 10 years before it is such a threat, if in fact it will be. However, I pointed out to him, this does not mean that we can sit back and relax for can't decrypt now, store them in data centers, and 20 years from now, if they can break them when computing's gotten cheaper or quantum computing's become available, they'll break them. And so I'm almost 80 years old. I'm 79 years old. 20 years from now, I might still be around, but I might not be. 20 years from now, the young people in the audience will still be around. And even my medical record should still be secret 20 years from now. So we need to be concerned now, and we should be taking action to prevent quantum computing from breaking. And not just quantum computing, it could be advances in cryptanalysis.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Yeah, I guess, remind everyone here about the NIST's ongoing process standardizing
Yes, but
quantum-resistant
post-quantum
cryptography,
cryptography.
and there is
Yep.
already 3 algorithms that have been standardized, and there is some more to come, and this is already available standards now, and people are migrating to this quantum-resistant or post-quantum schemes.
Yeah, by the way, Merkle trees figure in that, and
Yeah,
that's Ralph Merkle, who I mentioned.
yeah, yeah, definitely. Uh, there is one other question around what is the biggest opportunity and the open science today?
The biggest opportunity for open science today is for people to actually practice it. The United States is trying to go for national security. China's going for national security. Australia is guilty of it. I was in Timor-Leste, East Timor, uh, 9 years ago. And Australia had to pay, I think, $100 million, a large amount of money to Timor-Leste, because when they were negotiating offshore, who owned the offshore oil, Australia helped a number of companies, the Australian Intelligence Service helped a number of Australian companies to negotiate better. And this was eventually discovered, and Timor-Leste brought an international suit. So every
Mhm.
country in the world, it's not just the United States, it's not just Australia, Russia does it, China does it. So the biggest opportunity is to actually practice what we know to be true, which is that national security is becoming an obsolete concept. It's not yet obsolete, but it is becoming that. And we need to be working toward open science, toward international cooperation. I hang out at a center at Stanford called the Center for International Security and Cooperation, or CSAC, and
Mhm.
that's what's needed.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you for this answer. So we've got more questions here, so let me go to the next one. Any thoughts on members of the Royal Society resigning and signing open letters to expel Elon Musk from the RS?
So maybe I shouldn't do it, but I'm going to show you a picture. Can you give me back the screen?
Yeah.
Let me
Are we
just.
going to be in political trouble if you share?
No, no, no. Just a second. I'm going to show you a picture of me flying in my motor glider with Elon Musk. Let me see if I can find it. I've got photos. Where are photos? Oh well. Yeah. Oh, photos. Here we go. Uh, Musk. There we go. And I'm going to say share screen. I won't actually blow the whole thing up, but can you see it?
Ah, yes.
That was in 2020, not 24 and a half years ago. There's Elon and me with a beard flying in my motor glider. So, uh, what was the question again?
uh, Any thoughts on members of Royal Society resigning and signing open letters to expel Elon Musk from DRS, the Royal Society?
Well, fate has given us Donald Trump as the president. By the way, and Biden was also had problems. Uh, uh, Kevin Tillman, who some people may have heard of, his brother Patrick Tillman's more famous. He was killed in Afghanistan. He gave up a multi-million-dollar NFL contract. He was playing football to volunteer for the army right after September 11th, and he was killed by friendly fire in Afghanistan. And the Patrick Tillman Award is named for him, was given to Prince Harry, which horrified Patrick Tillman and Kevin Tillman's mother. But Kevin Tillman has an essay in which he writes that January 6th, which was the storming of the Capitol by, which I happen to agree was an attempt to overthrow the US government, it was the logical consequence domestically of what the United States has been doing for decades, if not centuries, overthrowing regimes all over the world. And by the way, it's not just us. Britain has done this. Russia has done this. Russia's trying to do this in Ukraine, although it's not as it's more nuanced than people think. So we really need to clean up our act. This is what's really needed, and getting rid of Elon Musk will not solve the problem. We need to figure ways to work on it. So I have one of the things that Donald Trump would love to do is win a Nobel Peace Prize, and I'm trying to work on that. So how can we attract people rather than fight them?
Hmm.
It's the approach I try to take as much as possible. Okay, next question.
Thank you. Okay, so there is a similar question to this earlier biggest opportunity and biggest threat question. What is the biggest opportunity and biggest threat in relation to the use of and development of generative AI?
Well, I don't know about generative AI, but roughly 40 years ago, IEEE Spectrum, which is the main publication of the IEEE, called me and said, "What's the biggest unsolved problem in cryptography?" And I said, "Lack of user awareness." And I'd say the same is true today with cryptography, with artificial intelligence, with climate change, uh, you name it. People just aren't concerned enough. The way Donald Trump was elected was because people felt that inflation was a problem, and they were concerned with immigration at our borders. We're having millions of people entering the United States without illegally or seeking asylum on questionable grounds. And I have problems because my grandparents came to this country as immigrants. And so it would be hypocritical of me to be against immigration. And yet I also recognize the reality that we need to make the world a better place so there aren't as many immigrants as we have. But instead, what the United States has done is to make the world uh, a more horrible place to live. And we need to make it a better place to live. When we do
Yeah.
that, we create friends, and that's the real strength of the United States and the West.
Maybe I'll have a follow-up question to this. So do you think uh, a better way to solve the immigration issue, if there is an issue, is rather to make those countries more livable than stop people?
Absolutely. It's I've argued that it's in our national security interest to the extent that illegal immigration is a national security issue, which it may be. Uh, the one of the best solutions is to make the rest of the world a better place to live. Because most people that come here don't want to come here. Most people that come here only come because it's impossible to live where they live. They're threatened with death. They're threatened with they can't get jobs. It's a horrible situation. We need to make the rest of the world more livable. And if we
Yeah.
do that, because I think, in fact, that it's crazy that once you're in the United States, even if you're here illegally and you get sick, a hospital will treat you. But when you live in some other country, we could care less about you. How does
Yeah.
that work? And why are we willing to spend all this money once someone's here, and we're not willing to spend anything when they're there? And this fits very much with dealing with the question of foreign aid. I'm very much in favor of more foreign aid, and I'm working on trying to reverse that.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, I'll look at the next one. Yeah, as I meant, I'll just remind everyone that if you have more questions, you can still use, and then we have a few more minutes for questions. The next one is about there are people who believe in open science but worried about the scrutiny if others go through your past work. For example, Claudine Gay in US being accused of plagiarism, I guess.
I'm sorry. So say that. Read that again.
There are people who believe in open science but worried about the scrutiny if others go through your past work, go through their past work, I guess. For example, Claudine Gay in US being accused of plagiarism. I think it's incomplete, but I think they meant to say plagiarism.
This is a problem. In fact, people pointed out to me 40 years ago that I'm working in cryptography, which is all about secrecy, and yet the kind of world we need is a more transparent world. And but we need to deal with reality. Companies don't want their secrets to be out in the open, and so we need to we're in a transition period. It's important to recognize that. It's not like we can jump to the kind of world that we need. We are in a world that, and parts of it may always be this way, where we will not be transparent, where there will be secrets, and yet we need to be working toward a more transparent world, a more open world, a better world, one where national security is seen as synonymous with international security. So I hope that helps some.
Yeah. Thank you for that as well. So the next question is around open science again. Do you believe that open science will help the development of science and technology in developing countries?
Well, I don't know whether it will, but I hope it will, and we need to be thinking about ways to do this. I've been working with. I just was recently learning about Bhutan, the country in the Himalayas next to Nepal and India and China, uh, and many people are leaving Bhutan because they can't get work there, and the really smart people can get jobs paying many times in the West what they can get in Bhutan. So we need to find ways to make the developing world, as it's called, more developed and certainly more attractive for people to stay there. We don't
Yeah.
want everybody living in the United States or Australia.
Yeah,
Or
that's true. Yeah.
that wouldn't be very good. I mean,
Yeah. There is a question around the social media. Any comment on social media giving up fact-checking in the age of disinformation?
that's a good point. I mean, certainly social media reinforces disinformation, but even the major media reinforces disinformation. I have a computerized library on Ukraine, on Iran, on the Middle East, and one of it is on messaging. And I have a whole sequence of papers that I've saved called that start NYT for New York Times bias. And the New York Times, which is supposed to be the paper of record, is horrible on certain issues. They are very biased, as is the Wall Street Journal, as is the Washington Post, and RT Russia Today does the same thing. And we need to clean our act up more generally. Like during the let's go back to Vietnam, which is a little safer period, although even in the United States it still isn't fully decided. But in Vietnam, I was a teenager at the time. I was just becoming of draft age. Lyndon Johnson said that we had to stand up to communist aggression in Vietnam. And I believed him. I was guilty of not thinking things through, not researching them. I now know, having researched it, that Lyndon Johnson was on the phone the day after he called an attack on a U.S. destroyer in the Tonkin Gulf unprovoked aggression on the high seas. I now know that he was talking to a friend of his in a formerly classified phone call that's on the LBJ Library website, so it's unquestioned provenance, in which he says, well, we were blowing up roads and bridges in that part of North Vietnam in covert operations, and I suppose they wanted to put a stop to it, so they fired on us and we sunk them. We need to question what we're told. We need to question the black and white, good, evil perspectives we're given. And representative of this, I'm Jewish. I'm assuming from your name that you're Muslim, Muhammad.
Yeah.
I declined to sign. I didn't refuse to sign. I declined to sign two letters that were presented to me by Israeli Americans after October 7th. both of which I agreed with, but neither of which I could sign because it only talked about one side of the problem. The first was by an Israeli-American woman who asked for the unconditional release of all the hostages, with which I totally agree. But it didn't talk about what the Netanyahu government was doing in Gaza and in the West Bank. And basically, there are Jews who are working for the first coming of the Messiah, just like there are Christians working for the second coming of the Messiah, by trying to expand out Israel's boundaries. And this has got to stop. So I told her I couldn't sign it because it only talked about one side, even though I agreed with that. The second was also by an American Israeli, a colleague of mine here at Stanford, and it apologized to the Palestinians. No, it says no ifs, ands, and buts. And I told him that's correct, but I can't sign that because it only talks about the apology of Jews to the Palestinians. It doesn't talk about the horrible things that the Palestinians have done to the Jews. And we need need to stop having a pro-Israeli or pro-Palestinian perspective. We need to have a pro-human perspective.
Yeah, yeah, thank you for that. So I think we have time for a couple more questions, and we'll have to keep the other ones to a later time, I guess. So the next one is about how would the international security best tackle the selfish countries only
So which
pursuing
countries?
as selfish countries only
Selfish
pursuing
countries.
national security, or worse, aggressive and imperialistic actions.
Well, right now all countries are selfish. So that what we really need to do is have one country start acting without it becoming unselfish. There's a book called The Parable of the Tribes that my wife read in the 1980s. It's a bit of a cult classic. And she told me I didn't have to read the book. She could summarize it in a few sentences. If there are 10 tribes, all of which are peaceful except one is warlike, the other 9 tribes will either become warlike or they will disappear. And so it seems to be that war will be with us forever. But the miracle is that we have in large parts of the world, in Western Europe, not all of Europe anymore because of Ukraine, but in Western Europe, we have France and Germany are good friends, which was inconceivable some time ago. We have, well, maybe it's changing, but the United States and Canada were good friends up until the current president wants to make it the 51st state. So we are progressing. I have a talk that I gave to at the annual meeting of Nobel laureates 6 years ago now, almost, on the technological imperative for ethical evolution, and we it's no longer just morally desirable that we become ethical. It's becoming essential for human survival. And how we do that is tricky because no one country can do it all at once. Fortunately, my talking this way is not going to change American policy. And I say fortunately because we live in a selfish world. But somebody needs to be pushing us in the direction of being unselfish, being more concerned with the whole.
Yeah. Thank you for that as well. So the next one is about the AI being used for surveillance weapons and technology intended to hurt people. Do you have any comments on giant tech companies removing such clauses from their terms and conditions?
Well, managing AI is going to be very difficult because there are such strong profit incentives for it to grow. I'm hoping that it can grow in a way that we can manage. And international cooperation, open science will certainly be essential to that. And we can't say that we want AI to be used only for good, as we now say, if we're building it into weapon systems.
Hmm. Yeah, right. Um, all right, I guess I'll take this as the last question since we are running out of time now. And this one is about the cryptographic community in particular. What do you think of the cryptographic community's current approach to open science? For example, papers being published on this IACR's ePrint.
Oh, I think cryptography has done a wonderful job. And this was one of the things you talked about in the introduction. that one of my great contributions that I'm most proud of is that we established the right of academic researchers who had not had access to classified information to publish their papers. NSA, the joke is it doesn't stand for National Security Agency. It stands for no such agency and never say anything. And So NSA originally in the late 70s, early 80s took the position that I was breaking the law by publishing my papers because I was publishing them in international journals which were exported. And the law defines anything cryptographic as an implement of war. And so I was exporting technical data on implements of war without a license. And ergo, I was in violation of the law. The good news is Admiral Inman, who was the director of NSA at the time, was asked about 8 years ago, maybe 10 years ago now, whether he would still try to suppress my work. And he said quite the opposite. With China stealing secrets, American commercial secrets with strong national security implications, he would try to get it out as quickly as possible.
Hmm. Yeah, there is similar things in Australia as well around like export controls, especially for cryptographic research and studies.
Yes, but the AES, the Advanced Encryption Standard, which is the current standard,
Yeah.
was done properly. And in fact, it's a Belgian, because it was submitted by 2 Belgians.
Yeah.
So we've come a long way compared to DES, which was submitted by IBM secretly, and we didn't know how they designed it. We didn't know what else was submitted, whereas AES was done very openly, very transparently.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. All right. I think we will be concluding here. Thank you very much, Martin, for your inspiring talk and taking time to answer all these questions. We appreciate your time. And thank you everyone for tuning in today. If you have any questions or feedback about this distinguished lecture series, we value your feedback and you can use this QR code on the screen to share your feedback and comments. So we will conclude the session here. Thank you very much, Martin, again, and thank you, everyone.
Well, thank you, Mohammed. Thank you for having me. And thank you all for listening.